Good afternoon. Those of you just joining us, welcome to the 12th Annual CRC CPPE Fall Ethics Symposium. The theme of this year's symposium is the ethics of saying things, free speech on American college campuses. Our third presenter for today will be Professor Robert Taylor, who will be speaking to us regarding John Stuart Mill on free speech. Professor Taylor is professor of political science at UC Davis. He specializes in contemporary analytic political philosophy and the history of liberal political thought. He's written numerous articles on Kant, Mill, Rawls, autonomy, self-ownership, and commercial republicanism. And he published his first book, Reconstructing Rawls, the Kantian Foundations of Justice is Fairness, in 2011. His second book, entitled Exit Left, Markets and Mobility in Republican Thought, was published by Oxford University Press in March 2017. Replying to Professor Taylor will be Professors Miles, Cushman, and Yancey. Professor Miles is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Quincy University in Illinois, where he teaches applied ethics, including medical ethics, business ethics, and political philosophy. His work centers on the intersection of epistemology and ethics, especially as it pertains to virtue theory. He's published on freedom of speech and pornography and international blasphemy laws in academic journals. He's currently writing a medical ethics textbook. Professor Cushman is Defenal de Hoy's Carlson Professor in Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at Wellesley College. He served as chairman of the Wellesley Sociology Department twice. Professor Cushman's teaching and research over his career at Wellesley focuses on sociological theory, comparative sociology, genocide, human rights, dissent and freedom of expression, and sociology of knowledge, ideology, and intellectuals. Professor Yancey is professor of sociology at the University of North Texas. His research interests include Christian studies, science, knowledge, religion, race, relations, interracial unions, and multicultural churches. He received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Please join me in welcoming Professor Taylor. Professor Taylor tells me he wants to wander, so we're going to give him a roving mic. But I need your help. If he starts to get too close to the edge of the stage, I need you to gesticulate wildly. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I'm going to be a free-range professor today and wander around. I hate being trapped behind a podium. So if you've been attending this entire conference, you've probably heard a name brought up many times, John Stuart Mill. And there's a reason for that. That is, I think, in my opinion at least, Mill offers the most sophisticated defense of freedom of speech in the entire Western intellectual tradition. There's some, strong competitors, I guess. There's John Milton's Areopagitica. There's Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? But nothing quite like this. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about his book on liberty, published in 1859, in the second chapter of the Liberty of Thought and Discussion. How many of you have read On Liberty, just out of curiosity? Anyone? A few people? That's okay. Not having a background is all right. In fact, if you do have a background, you may, at certain points in this lecture, go, wait a minute, what are you saying? So not having a background in it may work to my advantage in certain ways. So what kind of arguments Mill going to offer? There are many ways to defend freedom of speech, but what Mill's going to do is offer a defense of freedom of speech based upon the value of two things. First, the value of truth itself, and then second, the value of development. And what does he mean by development? I'll talk about that as I go on. But it's a particular kind of development of valuable human capacities, capacities for thought, capacities for action. And treating these things as intrinsically valuable, that is, things that are good in themselves. And probably in a strange way, his chapter 2 is best known for the argument from truth, from the value of truth. But I don't think that's the most interesting thing in this chapter. And I think actually, and I'll come to this, in our current political environment, the second argument about arguing for free speech from the value of self-development, that's going to turn out to be the more important one. So let me just dive right in. By the way, I've got up here page numbers you'll see. This is in reference to the John Gray edited On Liberty and Other Essays. I think it's in Oxford Classics, so if you want to go get a copy, you can follow along with the page numbers here. So Mill says at the end of chapter 2 that he had 4 distinct grounds for supporting freedom of opinion and its expression, but I'm going to collapse those into the 2 that I just talked about, right? Truth and development, and you'll see why here in just a second. But what I want to do is just like run you through his recap, and then I'll talk about these in greater detail. So the first one, he says, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for aught we can certainly know, be true. To deny this is to assume our own infallibility. So here the assumption is that conventional views may very well, or received views, may very well be completely false. And so if we try to censor dissenting views, right, heterodox views, we'll lose the opportunity to access truth. He has another one which I think in some sense is more, I'd call it more realistic, right, for reasons I'll get into in a second. He says, though the silenced opinion be an error, it may, and very commonly does, contain a portion of the truth. And since the general or prevailing opinion on any subject is rarely or never the whole truth, it is only by the collision of adverse opinions that the remainder of the truth has any chance of being supplied. So this is probably the more realistic case in which the prevailing opinion or the conventional opinion has some element of truth to it, but also some element of falsehood. And only the collision with an alternative point of view can point this out and lead to the kind of correction that's necessary. I'll give an example with respect to that regarding Martin Luther in just a second. Now, these first 2 grounds I think that he provides are all assuming one thing, that received opinion is either entirely false or partly false, and therefore needs to be corrected in some way. That's the reason why I say these arguments are really arguments from the value of truth. But what he does next is really interesting, okay? He, to use legalese, he goes on to argue in the alternative. He says, well, let's just assume that received opinion and conventional opinion is completely true, 100% true. Is there then any argument for freedom of thought and freedom of expression? Yes, and the argument remains a strong one, okay? And what's that going to look like? I'll just give you a little hint of what it's going to look like here. So the first thing he says is, even if the received opinion be not only true but the whole truth, unless it is suffered to be and actually is vigorously and earnestly contested, it will, by most of those who conceive it, be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds, right? Eventually he'll use this phrase, which I'll use a lot over the course of the talk, and that's the idea of a dead dogma. Here he's talking about the idea of a view just becoming a dogma, something you can repeat by rote, but you don't understand the meaning of the ideas in question because you don't know how those ideas are grounded and justified, right? And what does that lead to? A kind of atrophying of the mind. That's the reason why free speech in this case is necessary for developing the capacity for thought. But it goes much deeper than that, right? The problem with censorship is much worse. He says not only this, but the meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost or enfeebled and deprived of its vital effect on the character and conduct. The dogma becoming a mere formal profession, inefficacious for good, but cumbering the ground and preventing the growth of any real and heartfelt conviction from reason or personal experience. I'll come back to this quote when I talk about Christianity a bit later. But initially, this seems to be about the meaning of the doctrine, and it's certainly about that, but it's about something else, maybe something more important. If the meaning of the doctrine, if the finer essence is lost, then that doctrine can't move people to action. It doesn't lead them to live differently or to try to change the world. And these arguments are ultimately joined at the hip A failure to understand the grounds of your beliefs makes those beliefs impotent. Impotent in the sense they don't lead you to action, lead you to change yourself or the world. So now let me go through this in greater detail. So the first and second grounds. So switch, this thing's kind of heavy. The first and second grounds, these are in relation to truth, right? So these first two grounds he makes with, I think, great rhetorical brilliance. So one of the very persuasive things he does is he talks about examples of mistaken persecution, or things that we would recognize today as being mistaken examples of persecution, of Socrates, of Jesus, of Luther. These people were killed, crucified because of their views, and now it may not be the case that we take them to be completely right about everything they said, but we realize they brought certain truths into the world that weren't part of the world before their arrival. I'll use the example actually of Luther. I think this is relevant to really his second ground more than anything. I mean, there's some things that Luther talked about that I think remain pretty controversial today, even amongst people who are nominally Protestant, right? So for instance, the idea that we can be saved by faith alone. It's not works, it's just faith. It's a very radical idea, and it's a really hard idea for most people to accept. And most of the Protestants I know, they might pretend to believe it, but they don't really. They ultimately think that doing good things, gains favor with God, right? But that's not really consistent with Luther's own doctrine. It's faith alone that saves, right? So there's an example of something Luther brought into the world that, I don't know how to put it crudely, hasn't caught on in quite the way you might expect. But take another element, right, of his beliefs, and that's the idea that everyone should have the opportunity to read Scripture and interpret it for themselves. And he therefore pushed strongly for universal literacy, including among women, so that everyone could confront Scripture, confront religious texts, and understand it for themselves. Well, that's been so effective, right, that even Catholics have adopted it. All kinds of religious views have accepted this. It would be a very tough thing to present some kind of religious doctrine and say, well, it's based upon scriptures, but you're not going to be permitted to read it yourself and make your own judgment, right? Well, you can thank Luther for that, I think. So there's an example of a point of view that's not necessarily completely right, but it has aspects that have corrected our views, I think, in a useful, a beneficial way. But in a way, I'm actually going to take back something I say here in my slide in just a second, but I mean, in a way, you might think this is the easy part, right? I mean, few people are going to admit their own infallibility, and once they've admitted their fallibility, the case for open discussion is quite strong because we value truth so highly, right? I mean, even, the Pope only claims infallibility on doctrinal matters, not on everything in the world, right? And who's going to claim infallibility? Well, what worries, and by the way, this is a kind of argument, this argument from truth that you'll find in Milton's Areopagitica, so I don't think Mill is being particularly original here in the things that he has to say. But I think one problem with this is that even though if you ask people, and I think in our current political environment, I'm thinking about the extreme left and the extreme right of the political spectrum, right? I think if you were to ask people at these extremes, are you infallible? They would say, well, of course not. But then if you said, well, you hold belief X, and I have some contrary piece of empirical evidence A, they would say fake news. And then you'd say, well, how about contrary piece of empirical evidence B, fake news? So they may not claim infallibility on principle, but I think they're claiming it in practice, right? By their attitudes towards opposing views and opposing evidence. So I think infallibility actually may be a bigger problem than we think. They're not really open to evidence. And you might say, well, then the argument for free speech is dead. And Mill had to worry about this himself. He had to worry about sort of smug, middle-class views in Victorian England, people just thinking the truths of Christianity were obvious, no sensible person would question them. And so why did we need to have heterodox opinions in matters of religion? We'd already arrived at the truth, right? So he wasn't facing something that similar, but not entirely dissimilar either. And again, I think this is why the third and fourth grounds are really this ground, what I'm calling one ground of development, is the thing that's really interesting. Again, he argues in the alternative, he accepts the truth of prevailing opinion for the sake of argument. He doesn't necessarily think Victorian English have gotten it all right? Doesn't actually think that, but he says, but let's just assume that that's true, right? Even if it is, there's still an argument for the value of free expression. And what his discussion of these next two grounds, right? What they indicate, it's not merely what we believe that matters, right? That we've gotten it right in some sense, that we have the true belief. It's also how we believe it. So Plato, in many of his works, including The Republic, makes a distinction between true opinion and knowledge. True opinion would be being right, but not knowing why you're right. Knowledge is about not just being right, but understanding the reasons for why you're right, being able to justify your views, being able to provide rational grounds for your views. So he says at the beginning of the subsection, an opinion that goes unchallenged, he says, will be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth. This is a great mnemonic device, right? Because it turns out in that phrase, dead dogma, and on the associated phrase, living truth, you've got a nice way of remembering the two parts of his argument, right? So if you don't come to understand the grounds of your beliefs, you'll hold that belief as a dogma, and it'll limit the development of your capacity for thought. That may lead to a situation where the dogma, this belief, becomes dead to you, dead in the sense that it doesn't move you to action, doesn't lead you to change your life and the world. So let's talk about those grounds in sequence here. So to hold an opinion as a dead dogma or a prejudice is to be unaware of its grounds and unfazed by its meaning. What does Mill say of 3? He says, if the cultivation of the understanding consists in one thing more than another, it is surely in learning the grounds of one's own opinions. Whatever people believe, they ought to be able to defend against at least the common objections, right? Nothing is more embarrassing than stating an opinion than having somebody make the most obvious objection and not being able to effectively respond to it, right? You don't really understand what it is you believe if that's the case. So essential is this discipline to a real understanding of moral and human subjects that if opponents of all important truths do not exist, it is indispensable to imagine them and supply them with the strongest arguments which the most skillful devil's advocate can conjure up. So these cultivations of mental skills that we get by understanding the grounds of our belief, again, they're so important. If opponents don't exist, we have to create those opponents. Fortunately, in our political world, we don't just have devil's advocates, we have actual devils moving amongst us, and so we don't have to worry about having your views challenged. They will be challenged in the most straightforward ways imaginable. So why is this challenge essential? I've already been hinting at it. It's because it allows us to grow as thinkers. So Mill says, the fact, however, is that not only the grounds of the opinion are forgotten in the absence of discussion, but too often the meaning of the opinion itself. The words which convey it cease to suggest ideas or suggest only a small portion of those they were originally employed to communicate. So instead of a vivid conception and a living belief, there remain only a few phrases retained by rote, or if any part, the shell and husk only of the meaning is retained, the finer essence being lost. So since I'm going to talk about some stuff Mill has to say about Christianity, I'll just use a religious example here. Take something like a religious ritual like reciting the Lord's Prayer. The Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, etc. People often say this in the course of religious rituals. They might say it multiple times a day. Do you think if you're saying that multiple times a day, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, you're even paying attention to what you're saying? It just becomes a meaningless mantra. You're not thinking about the words and what those words mean and what those words might require you to do, how they might require you to live differently. That's what it means when something becomes just a husk of a belief and the finer essence is lost, right? But as you read through Mill, I think you come to the conclusion that it's not just a concern for meaning that he's caring about here, it's a concern for the vitality, what makes a belief a living belief that he cares about. So especially what he calls the testing of opinion by personal experience. So he says, as he says of most Christians, I'll have to sort of explain what I think he means when he says this. He says, whenever conduct is concerned, they look round for Mr. A and Mr. B to direct them how far to go in obeying Christ. So, imagine a good upper middle class person wandering into their church. They sit down in the pew, and the minister comes out and starts speaking about the gospel, right? Maybe he talks about the early primitive Christian church and its practices of communalism, of giving up private property. Maybe he talks about Christ's disciples and what Christ said to them. Give up your possessions, give up your family, follow me, right? Maybe he relates some of Jesus' sayings. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the upper middle class person is sitting there thinking about his sweet house and sweet BMW sitting in the driveway and his lovely family. And he thinks to himself, what is this minister is saying? It makes me uncomfortable. And then he looks to Mr. A and Mr. B. He looks down the pew. He says, well, that person hasn't given up their house. That person hasn't given up their car. That person hasn't given up their family. Neither is Mr. B. Everything must be okay, right? I'm still a disciple of Christ. I'm sitting in a church, after all, right? I've passed through. I can go through and repeat the mantras, right? I can tell you, I can quote you chapter and verse. But I think what Mill is saying is, these are believers only in the weakest sense, if at all. Are they really, is this a bad Christian, or is it just not even a Christian at all, right? Christianity is a radical doctrine, a really radical doctrine, right? If you take it seriously, if you want to live like Christ, you can't accept something like, what's called the prosperity gospel, the idea that God wants you to be wealthy. If you've ever read the Gospels, this view is absurd. It's completely absurd. It has nothing to do with the message of the Gospels, right? And what Mill is saying, though, is what people get comfortable in their habits. And they may even sincerely think that they are a Christian, even as they continue to live in ways that are not like the life of Christ at all. Now, I've been talking about this, again, as a haute bourgeois person, in a kind of contemptuous tone, but really, maybe the proper attitude is one of pity, right? Because they believe themselves to be good Christians, but again, all it is to them is words and meaningless rituals. They don't see the harsh ethical demands that Jesus makes of his disciples, right? And as a consequence, they don't change in any way. It doesn't lead them to modify their lives. It doesn't lead them to modify the world. Maybe what they ought to do is give up their house and give up their car, but that's a hard thing to do, right? So one of the things that Mill wants you to understand, I think, is that 3 and 4 are really tightly connected. Right? And in what way? Well, opinions atrophy from disuse, both in thought and in action. A dead dogma is an opinion whose lack of grounding, not understanding why it is you believe this thing, not understanding its rational grounds, prevents it from motivating behavior and leading you to change who you are, right? Also, I'd say observe the connection between these two grounds and what I'll call Mill's perfectionism. I'll come back in a second to that claim that Mill is some kind of perfectionist. What does it mean to be a perfectionist, roughly? It's to believe that there are certain kinds of valuable human capacities, in this case, capacities for thought, capacities for action, and that the development and exercise of those capacities is something that's intrinsically good, something that's good in and of itself, right? But I think what Mill would say with regard, insofar as he is a perfectionist, the failure to challenge opinions hinders both our intellectual growth and our capacity and desire to carry belief into action. So again, Mill's support for freedom of speech is certainly partly about the truth, but I think the thing that matters more to Mill, and is maybe more relevant in this particular environment, is that, more importantly, it's about the development of human capacities for thought and action. Even people at the political extremes who might, when pushed, say, well, ultimately, I think my opinions are 100% right, or as a practical matter, they are, right? So what difference would it make if I heard opposing views? But the problem with that is there's the great risk that if you don't have opposing views presented, ultimately your beliefs become a dead dogma, just a husk of a belief, and not a living kind of faith. That's the risk, right? Even if we set the question of truth aside. That's a really powerful argument, and a unique argument, I think, in defense of freedom of speech. Now, what I want to do is do some practical applications, right? I mean, this has been operating at a reasonably, oh, sorry, I wanted to say one more thing, actually, for those of you who know something about Mill. I'm making a claim here about Mill being a perfectionist. Well, if you know anything about Mill, you might say, wait a minute, I thought Mill was a utilitarian, right? In fact, he wrote an essay called Utilitarianism. It would take too much time to sort of explain my claim here. If you know that Mill's a utilitarian, you might be saying to yourself, well, the only thing that Mill thinks is intrinsically good are pleasure, right? Especially higher pleasures, not something like the development of these kinds of particular human capacities. It turns out the answer to that little puzzle, how you square this particular circle, has to do with Mill's doctrine of qualitative hedonism. Qualitative hedonism basically leads you, and once you understand it, I think, it will lead you to realize that Mill is strictly, that is by the letter, a kind of utilitarian, but in spirit, he's a perfectionist. But I'm not going to say any more about that. Happy to talk about it in Q&A. So now, practical applications, right? So again, operating at a fairly high level of abstraction, but what does this doctrine of free speech have to tell us about controversial issues, right? If it was something, it was about defending people's right to speak on tax policy, pretty much any defense of free speech would support people's right, presumably, to talk about tax policy, right? So I want to talk about more controversial issues to get a feel for the contours of Mill's argument for free speech. And of course, the question you always have to ask in these contexts is a simple one. Does protecting a particular category of speech promote truth or development? Because if it promotes neither truth nor development in any significant way, then I don't think you're going to have a Millian argument for protecting that category of speech. That's not to say that that category of speech can't be protected or shouldn't be protected on other grounds, right? But on Millian grounds, at least, the case will be weak. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through sort of 5 categories of speech. The first 3, I'm going to suggest that the Millian grounds for protecting them are pretty weak, actually. So that would tend to favor restrictions of a certain kind. But for the last 2, I'm going to suggest that at least on a certain reading, the Millian case for protecting them is strong. So let me sort of start stepping through these. I'll try to make references to constitutional law cases when they're relevant, okay? So the first is fighting words, right? So think about racial epithets, the N-word, right? That's a classic case of a fighting word. Fighting word being the kind of thing that if you utter it to a person, if you go up to a black person and say the N-word, there's a decent chance that a violent response will occur. They'll be extremely angry, right, and maybe strike against you. Or take something like curses of various kinds. So like the early fighting words case, sort of controlling case, is Chaplinsky, 1942. And it's a case where a Jehovah's Witness in a public place goes up to a cop and starts abusing the cop, and one of the things that the Jehovah's Witness says is that the cop is a damned fascist, right? And this is a pretty harsh thing to say in 1942, obviously. So as a result of this, the Jehovah's Witness was found guilty of breaching public peace. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the conviction. And the question is why? And the reasons for it, I think, are reasonably Millian if you read the decision, because if you just ask the question, how is the truth protected by allowing someone to call a cop a damned fascist? I mean, how does this inform us in any way? I guess it lets us know that at least one member of the population thinks this cop is a damned fascist, right? I don't know if that's a particularly useful piece of information, one that advances truth much. How about development? Does it develop people's intellectual capacities or capacities for action? Again, not really clear that that's the case. I really doubt the cop went home and thought long, hard, and deep about whether he was a fascist or not, right, upon being called that. So I think the Millian case for protecting these kinds of words is fairly weak. Now I want to be clear, that doesn't mean there can't be a case made for protecting the use on constitutional grounds, protecting the use of fighting words, right? There might be all kinds of other considerations that would come into play, what I would call sort of secondary considerations. So here's one possibility. There's the question of what counts as fighting words, right? The problem with fighting words laws is that they may be, you know, again, these sort of legal terms, void for vagueness, right? Or they might generate chilling effects. Why? Because it's not clear what counts as a fighting word in what context. I mean, the example I used of the N-word is like a little too easy, right? Now, if somebody came up to me and accused me of being a Derridian, that is a follower of Derrida, the French philosopher Derrida, I'd have to really restrain myself from punching them in the nose. Now, so if you came up and just sort of said, hey, Taylor, you sound like kind of like a Derridian, right? How would you know that that would be the thing that would set me off? You'd have to know me pretty well, right? But this just brings up the bigger issue, which is how are you going to operationalize fighting words laws? Well, you get all kinds of claims about reasonable people. Reasonable people know that you don't use certain kinds of words in certain kinds of contexts. Well, that's fine if the punishment is just ostracism, but if it's jail time or a fine, you'd want a little more clarity about where the line is, right? And so you could know when you've crossed it. Now, that's not a specifically Millian argument, but that might be a good argument for not punishing fighting words. But again, my main point is just to suggest that for Mill, great defender of free speech that he is, he doesn't speak to this particular issue specifically. It seems very unlikely he's going to say that legislation against fighting words is problematic on his own grounds, okay? Again, if you're some kind of free speech absolutist, Mill is challenging you here and will in the next two examples as well. How about falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater? This is a classic one, right? So this is from Schenck, 1919, Holmes, right, uses this example in terms of, in a case dealing with draft resistors, okay? Well, again, if you ask a basic question about truth and development, how is truth promoted when someone intentionally and falsely shouts fire in a crowded theater? I don't think it advances truth. I don't really see how that would be the case. How about promoting development of various kinds? I guess it might promote physical development. People will be sprinting for the exit, but probably not intellectual or moral development in any way. So again, I think the case is weak. I mean, obviously, on Millian grounds, again, the case is weak for protecting this kind of speech. Again, there are certain kinds of considerations that will come up in the next example. For instance, you don't want to punish people who didn't know it was false, right? Maybe they saw a flame or something. You want to encourage that kind of speech. But at least if they know it's false, I don't really see that there's a strong Millian argument for protecting it. Here's one that's maybe a little more controversial, incitement to riot. And here, as Tom pointed out in his own talk, Mill offers a particular example in On Liberty, right? And that's the example of, you know, the agitator before the house, or maybe it's the business, of the corn dealers, you know, who claims that corn dealers are starvers of the poor, right? Poor children not eating because corn dealers are trying to corner the market and drive up prices. And the question Mill asks is, well, if somebody is delivering a fiery speech against corn dealers in front of the houses of the corn dealers, and there's an angry mob there, might they be punished or have their speech restricted? And Mill doesn't seem to think this is particularly problematic in this case because of the enormous harm, physical harm, that can result if a riot takes place. Here I think it's a tough question. It's partly a tough question because surely context matters a lot, right? The example that Mill uses is specifically one where I think it's the case that there's likely to be a riot that occurs, right? Somebody using fiery language of this kind in front of a crowd that's angry. And look, the corn dealers' homes or businesses are right there, right next to them. And it seems like it could be imminent. It could happen quickly, right? In a way that the authorities couldn't intervene in any way effectively. Now, the case would be different, you know, if this was a speech that was written down and you were reading it calmly in your home, right? Maybe in front of a crackling fire with a nice, you know, glass of beer beside you. And as you read it and you read about the corn dealers starving the poor, you might think to yourself, damn those corn dealers. And then think, I need another beer, right? Instead of going out and rioting and injuring corn dealers, you're easily distracted in that context. So surely the context matters in this case, And in fact, that is what you find in sort of the, I think at this point at least, the controlling case in First Amendment jurisprudence would be Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969. And basically in that case, it was about a Klan rally at somebody's farm, okay, out in the country. And, you know, as the Klan does, they were saying all kinds of incendiary things, literally and figuratively. And the Brandenburg court finds that the idea that there was some kind of breach of the peace there didn't hold. Why? Well, a rule is promulgated, and the rule says in order to be punished for incitement, it needs to be the case that violence is likely to result and that violence will be imminent. That sets actually a very, very high bar. I'm not aware of any cases, even remotely recently, where anybody was actually successfully prosecuted, right? Because precisely the bar is set so high. And of course, there's a reason for that, right? I mean, part of the reason for it is that even in these contexts, and again, context matters a lot, sometimes there may be discussions had or ideas expressed that can promote truth, that can promote development. As a consequence of that, you want to make sure the bar is very high for being punished under these circumstances, lest those forms of development be crippled in some way. But nonetheless, in principle, again, incitement to riot, that can be something that's regulated on Millian grounds. But I suspect that Mill would agree with the result in Brandenburg. He would say the bar needs to be high for punishing that kind of speech. So those are all examples where I think, interestingly enough, the apostle of freedom of speech would actually be reasonably friendly to certain kinds of regulations of speech, or what, maybe I should say more restrictions of speech. People often distinguish between those things. Regulations being things that just try to make speech, whatever its content, mutually consistent, like you talk and then I talk, et cetera, right? Whereas restrictions on speech being things that are related to the content of speech. Now let me basically talk about a couple of cases where I think Mill would be more interested in protecting the category of speech. So the first example, or at least some types of it, right? First case, defamation, libel. So saying something that's untrue about somebody or some group, right? Now, in the case of private defamation, I think the Millian case for protecting it is probably fairly weak. I mean, suppose you have somebody intentionally and falsely claiming that their neighbor is a pedophile. Well, that's certainly a kind of defamation, form of libel. It's not really clear how that advances truth. It seems to undermine it, and it's not really clear how it leads to greater intellectual or moral or active development, okay? But maybe a more interesting example is with respect to public figures, or especially public officials. So one of the great cases regarding defamation is the New York Times versus Sullivan, which had to do with the jailing of Martin Luther King Jr. and an ad that was run in the New York Times that claimed that this jailing had to do with resistance to attempts to bring about racial integration, right? So in this case, the court took a sort of interesting view. It really expanded free speech rights and limited claims of defamation and claims of libel by setting a very, very high bar for successful claims. It's not enough to show that the claim being made is false. And it turns out in this ad that was run in the New York Times, there were a variety of falsehoods in that ad. The court said it has to be the case that not only are they false, but false claims were made with actual malice. And actual malice would include either knowing that the claims were false or reckless disregard for whether they were true or false. And again, that sets a very high bar. Now, why is a high bar being set there? Why does it make sense to set the bar that high? And again, I think there's a case to be made on Millian grounds. And in this case, not so much Millian grounds of development, but Millian grounds of truth. We care deeply about knowing whether our public officials are engaged, say, in acts of corruption or some kind of abuse of power that's inconsistent with basic norms of justice, right? We care about that deeply, and therefore we don't want to do anything that would discourage people from making claims about public officials, for informing us of malfeasance on the part of those public officials. We're willing to accept a whole series of false claims, right, in return for the occasional claim that turns out to be true, so that we can hold those officials responsible. And again, I think you can make that case on Millian grounds, but this one related to the value of truth. And here, truth about knowing what public officials are up to in a democracy. And let's face it, I mean, power is something that's easily abused, and there are many checks on this. One of those checks happens to be a free press, right? So it's extremely important that we encourage reporters to do this kind of reporting of malfeasance. The recent examples of sexual harassment, which I'll come to at the end, certainly come to mind in this context. And again, it's worth paying the price, I think, in terms of false accusations for that, at least with respect to public officials. The last example, and you might think I covered it maybe with the example of fighting words, but I want to talk about hate speech as a category separate from fighting words. So don't think about hate speech as being about fighting words. Think about hate speech in this more narrow, restricted way. Hate speech, here I'll just read out my redefinition, understood as a kind of group libel, okay? A kind of defamation against a group. So speech, spoken or written, that argues, okay? It's not a symbol, it's not a simple word of abuse, it's an actual argument with premises, empirical claims, deductions, conclusions, etc., that argue for the mental, physical, or ethical inferiority of members of certain historically oppressed groups, blacks, women, Jews, gays. So maybe like a classic example of this would be, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? This horrendous anti-Semitic tract. Henry Ford, of all people, published like 500,000 copies of this thing and distributed around the United States. I mean, this thing is pretty grotesque. It argues that Jews are bent on global domination. It repeats, the usual nonsense about blood libel, the idea that Jews are collecting Christian children and bleeding them and then taking the blood and using it in religious ceremonies. It has all that stuff. But it's an argument, not a very good argument, but it's an argument and a series of interconnected arguments. Now the question is, what kind of attitude should we have towards that kind of speech? Let's call, again, I'm going to call that, you're going to use it as a technical term, hate speech. It's hate speech that involves argumentation. What's the proper Millian attitude towards that? Well, obviously with something like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, I'm not really sure what the truth value is of allowing something like that to be published. And maybe that's what gives it a particular contemporary relevance. But I think it is extremely important on the grounds of development, of intellectual and moral self-development. And that's because what does it challenge? And what do things like it, hate speech like this, what does it challenge? It challenges deeply held beliefs we have in religious, racial, and gender equality, right? And why is that important? Well, for the very reasons that Mill talked about. Unless those views are challenged, they will become dead dogmas. We will not understand their grounds, and those beliefs will not move us to action anymore. And I was just thinking about this recently in the context of these sexual harassment claims that have been made, right? Think about Al Franken, for instance, or Charlie Rose. That one was like extremely shocking. It just came out recently. In those cases, I have absolutely no doubt that if you had gone to Al Franken and Charlie Rose and it said, do you believe in gender equality? They could have repeated, chapter and verse, again, all of the elements of the mantra of feminism. They would have been completely committed to it, and they would have been sincerely committed to it. And yes, it didn't affect their behavior towards all those women, right? And the question is, why? Well, maybe they were just sort of straightforward hypocrites, right? And when I say straightforward hypocrites, I mean hypocrites of a certain kind. There's an old saying that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. Maybe they were that kind of hypocrite. Maybe they didn't really believe these things, but maybe they really did believe in feminism, but feminism to them is a dead dogma. Mill would say, this is what a dead dogma looks like in practice, that people can actually think they're committed feminists because they can repeat words, right? Repeat the mantra, and yet there's a complete disconnect between their beliefs and their actions. And if they just thought about it, if they were challenged, they'd see that there was that kind of disconnect, right? Or maybe in this case, if the doctrines of feminism were regularly challenged, it would bring this to their attention. They would think longer and harder about whether their own actions were consistent with their supposed commitment to feminism. So I think this is an excellent example, an example that goes back to the one that I used with respect to the Christians, right? That it can be the case that people can sincerely believe that they're followers of a certain set of doctrines, and yet if it's simply an empty husk to them, then they won't understand its grounds and it won't move them to action. And it will be a certain kind of hypocrisy, but a rather sad kind of hypocrisy that's consistent with them sincerely believing in the thing that they believe in or claim to believe in, right? So let me just conclude by saying the following. I mean, again, depending upon what your views are, you're going to react to Mill, I think, in different ways. If you're a kind of free speech, First Amendment absolutist, you're not going to be happy with all the exceptions that are involved here, right? And I think, though, that if you think that a case for free speech needs to be grounded on the values of truth and self-development, maybe you ought to be open to the possibility, at least, that certain types of restrictions should be allowed on speech, right, within limits. On the other hand, you might be the sort of person who says, I don't even like the degree to which Mill's arguments support free speech, right? I'm horrified by the idea of hate speech, even if it comes in the form of a detailed argument like that of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? And again, in those cases, I think you have a couple of paths to take. One, or maybe three paths to take. One is you can take issue with my interpretation of Mill and the way that I applied Mill. You can accept his theory, but take a look at the consequences of it and say to yourself, I need to change my views. I need to change my considered convictions about speech because they're inconsistent with Mill's own theory, which I've accepted. Or finally, you might say, I can't accept these consequences and have to reject the theory itself, find some other way of defending free speech in a way that can carve out, or not carve out, but basically include hate speech in forms of restriction, right? But I think regardless of which of these approaches you take, you'll find an engagement with Mill's work to be valuable, and I strongly encourage you to read On Liberty if you haven't read it. Thank you.
Professors Yancey, Miles, and Cushman will now offer some brief comments. It's up to you, Professor Taylor, whether you'd like to answer serially or all in all. Great, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. As a non-philosopher, it is always interesting to hear a discussion of someone like as Mills. So I guess I come at it with new ears, having never read it or things of this nature, but obviously having thought about some of these issues. And just some of the ideas, when you're talking about infallibility, I couldn't help, and this is, probably from my own training, thinking about confirmation bias, that we know we're not infallible, but our confirmation bias constantly helps us to sort of act as if we are. That we seek out the information that confirms our previous conceptions, and I think that's it's well documented that is, and so yes, you ask anyone, hey, are you perfect? No one has the chutzpah to say yes, I am, but we just act as if we are, and so I think that's a very, very insightful position. I have a couple of either questions or pushbacks, however you want to put it. One of the things that can happen, I think, is something can be true, but we can take it to the extreme. For example, one of the examples I like to give is it can be true that we should love other people. To the extreme, that becomes codependent. It can be true that we shouldn't, that we need each other, but you don't want to become that uncle who's always who's still mooching off mom and dad. So when you're pursuing truth, I mean, I think there's another option. What you may believe may be true, it may be 100% true, but then you can almost ruin it by putting too much into it. There's a need for balance that is there, and so I don't know how that would fit in with Mill's ideas on whether, even if what you believe is true, that free speech would help. But that's just an idea that I just want to toss out there. A second idea I have is, I think Mill's argument really makes sense when you're trying to defend an idea, even though that idea may not be correct or 100%. I think, I think that makes a very good case for that. But then again, there's also expressions in speech that may not be ideas, and yet do we still allow them? And what comes to my mind is pornography. What would Mills do? I mean, when I was thinking about the 5 things you gave up there, I was wondering where pornography was, whether that was going to be one of them and where that was going to fit. I wasn't looking for porn up there, but I was looking for the idea, is pornography, and I mean, now you can make a porno that has a message, but my suspicion is most pornos do not have a message, do not have an idea that they're pushing, but that they are pushing certain images. Would Mills defend that or not? I mean, I'm not sure, but you're the expert, so that's the question I just would push at you and see how you would want to react to that.
Should we? Okay. A couple of things. I think one of the things, this is more related to some of the earlier discussions, that I think one of the things people need to remember when they communicate is that human communication is vastly imperfect, and that every human communicator in communication with other human communicators makes mistakes. They make assumptions about people, they make assumptions about what they believe, they think they might believe something because they're a member of X, Y, or Z group. And in some ways I think the underpinning of Mill's demand that we be tolerant of other people's views and welcome other people's views is that we should be more charitable and forgiving of people's mistakes. This is one thing I think is problematic in some of the discourse that goes on in our country now and in the universities, is that people seem to be really unforgiving and even vicious sometimes when people make mistakes in communication that are not intended, that they just kind of, this whole concept of microaggressions, for instance. I mean, it's, most microaggressions are not known to be aggressions by the person saying them. I mean, when you, in legal jurisprudence, aggression usually involves some intent, but microaggressions are unintended slights that people might make out of ignorance or not thinking through things. So, I think that's one lesson of Mill. But to kind of go in George's vein, that's just a comment. This is more of this is a Millsian. I'm actually a Millsian. I admit it. That. My program is founded on Millsian principles, so I'm acknowledging my own biases and assumptions, but Mill would demand that if I'm a Millsian, that I be critical of Mill. So my criticism would be this, and it's often leveled at him. Here's a guy, a British guy, well-off guy, white guy, writing in the 19th century about freedom of, all this discourse and openness, and there's good evidence that his book was co-authored by his wife, Harriet Mills, whom he loved almost, the story is, it's a wonderful love story. He loved her so much that he moved to France and built a monument to her and lived next to it for the rest of his life. But he praised her all the time as his soulmate, his intellectual comrade. But at the time, it wouldn't have been possible for her to be a co-author officially. So that the community that Mill lived in was a community of citizens who had education, who had some wealth and power and access to communication, and that whole Millsian paradigm leaves out all of the people that couldn't engage in these kinds of discussions, and that therefore it's outdated and not necessarily relevant today. That would be the critique to which I would answer, and maybe you could answer as well, that it may have been in that situation context specific, right? So only mainly, it's just kind of a book for other white men who have privilege and power and education. But I think that the lessons of his book are more important than ever for people who are disenfranchised or who are marginalized because reference to what Casey was saying before, that the way forward, the way to progress is through knowledge, and that the lessons shouldn't be thrown out. You shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, and maybe these lessons still are relevant to today. So there's a lot there, but that's it. So.
So I waited till last because I'm a Mill geek. You may be a Millian, but I'm a Mill geek. I mean, I've read it all, and I wrote my dissertation on Mill. I wrote it on the self-development argument in Mill. So I have to be careful that I don't geek out and just start, because our purpose is to just give you things to sort of stimulate the discussion, not for me to all geek out on Mill here. So I want to deal with one sort of thought experiment to challenge Mill's view, and this is one that I've dealt with and thought about a lot. So the thought experiment starts off with the idea that Mill is making what I call an instrumental argument for free speech. That is, the value of free speech is in the thing that it gets us to, right? And there have been lots of different things. So the instrumental argument goes like this. If free speech is valuable for X, right, then a particular kind of speech is valuable insofar as it gets us to X, right? And the main critique, so if free speech is valuable for truth, then some speech can be evaluated on whether or not it gets us to truth. If it's about democracy, then it's to what extent does it help us with democracy? Mill's particularly vulnerable to this because he's a consequentialist in a weird sort of way. Things are right or wrong in virtue of the consequences that result. Okay, so here's the difficulty with the instrumental arguments are there's always some kind of speech that undermines that particular instrumental value, right? So if you say it's to produce truth, then there's speech that's false, libel, all these various things. And I think I should say I think you're absolutely right that the self-development argument is a much stronger argument for Mill than his truth argument. And I don't think that gets brought out enough in the discussions. And, if it's democracy, we could have speech that wants to overthrow democracy. So what do we do with that speech, right? And this is the kind of idea. Now, the response to that is the dead dogma, right? If we close out the anti-democratic speech or the anti-truth speech or the anti-development speech, I mean, I could argue there's kinds of speech that undermines the idea of development. Susan Bryson brings this up, that if your goal is for people to be autonomous and developed individuals, hate speech fits the category of undermining people's ability to think of themselves as autonomous and self-developing kinds of creatures, right? But then the response is, well, because of dead dogma. That's the, if you've ever heard of a Moat and Bailey kind of argument, I know I'm going too long. I'm sorry. I told you I was a geek. That, if we can't defend this, we'll move up here to this thing here. And the defense is dead dogma. And here's my thought experiment. The Museum of Bad Ideas, okay? So the Museum of Bad Ideas is a thought experiment in which all of the really repugnant and awful things that people have believed over the years that we have felt like we have to get rid of because they undermine whatever value it is that we associate with free speech, truth, democracy, self-development, all of these things. We could put it in the Museum of Bad Ideas, and with all of our technology, we could make sure that, we could do it animatronically, like the Hall of Presidents at Disney World, right? And they could express their horrible ideas, right? But we could all decide to go in there. Maybe even we could encourage people. We could give a tax break if you go to the Museum of Bad Ideas every so often or whatever. But the point is this. We don't have to have devils as long as we have the devil's advocates. And that's the challenge, right? I don't have to have the actual Richard Spencer, who's neo-Nazi, as long as I have the animatronic Richard Spencer reading the Protocols of Zion, and people can get to hear it and those sorts of things. And I don't have to look at his ugly mug on the TV, and we don't have to be subjected to him in the university or those sorts of things. Now, this was a puzzle that was presented to me when I was writing my dissertation. I have my ideas about this, but I wanted to hear what you think.
So I don't want to go on too long in my response. I'll just maybe pick on just a few things, and maybe they'll all come back to this idea of resilience that I talked about in one of the comments I made earlier. Yeah, George's comment about pornography. I guess it sort of depends in some sense about what the argument is like. So is the claim, I mean, I guess if the claim is something like pornography, is it the sort of thing that promotes truth or promotes development? It could, you know. It could provide information about sexuality, right? About people's preferences with regard to sex, about their behavior or sexual actions. So it certainly could provide information of various kinds, maybe information that in some cases can be deceptive. Self-development, right? I mean, having preconceptions about sexuality challenged may also be useful and something that encourages development. But even if we set those aside, I don't know exactly what the concern is with respect to pornography. Some people claim that certain forms of pornography, for instance, can encourage violence against women, right? And in that case, pornography would be something, it'd fall into almost a category like incitement, right? It's the sort of thing that might lead to bad behavior. And I guess in that case, I think things can be a bit more complicated, right? If that connection could be established, as it hasn't been, I think, to this point, and established really solidly, then we might have to think about the possibility that Mill, at least in certain cases, could in fact acknowledge the possibility of some kind of regulation of pornography. How about the microaggressions that Tom brought out? There, I think, again, I'd go back to resilience, and you could even go deeper into Mill's philosophy and say, really what's grounding his views on self-development, again, is his qualitative hedonism. The qualitative hedonism says there are higher and lower pleasures, and there are also higher and lower forms of pain, I would say. And the highest form of pain, I suppose from Mill's perspective, is the pain of ignorance, this pain of a stultifying social environment. And the lowest kind of pain is the pain of offense, to be offended by something. Certainly, I think he would say that with respect to pornography. He would just say, if pornography offends you, get tougher skin, basically. I mean, get over it would be Mill's response. And we can train people to be resilient in various ways. And I think that would certainly be his view on that. Also with the questions of hate speech undermining self-development, again, I think resilience in some sense could be a possible answer. Change the causal pathway. If it's the case that it does undermine self-development, then maybe we ought to socialize people and educate people in such a way that hate speech doesn't undermine self-development. They let it roll off their backs, or they respond in an appropriate way. So through education, maybe we can make it the case that contra Bryson, it doesn't in fact undermine self-development. I'd never thought about the examples. Like, can devil's advocates really substitute for devils? And I suspect in many cases, no. I don't think that museum would be particularly effective, right? I haven't thought that through thoroughly. I think in some sense we can be grateful for the existence of, Richard Spencers in the world, if there aren't too many of them, maybe, precisely because they can seem a threat. And if they seem to be a threat, we take their views much more seriously and think a lot harder about how we might respond to those views and how we might defend our own commitment to racial equality, for example. If it's an animatronic, device in a museum, we're probably much less likely to think through those counter-arguments.
The floor is now available for your questions and comments. I'll be assisted by Professor Kyle Swan.
Hi there. I'm just curious about how far Mill would be willing to avoid the dead dogma. For example, let's say global warming is real, and it's very real. And we can either have a world where it's going to lead to a really bad world because everybody keeps talking about it, everybody's opinions being shared, it keeps being discussed, and nothing's going to be actually done about it. Or would we rather have a world where the dead dogma is very real and we have this very advanced civilization where everybody's running pretty efficiently environmentally, so that works more in a practical sense? So I'm just curious about how he would go through that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, sometimes dead dogmas about certain kinds of issues can be maybe pretty useful. It'd be nice if people weren't so critical or weren't so skeptical of these things. I think what Mill would say, though, is that, again, even with respect to something like global warming, or let's say more specific, anthropogenic global warming, the idea that it's it's human actions that are bringing this about. I think you would say that insofar, again, as it's a dogma we don't allow it to be criticized, right? We censor views, for instance, that call into question global warming, right, or anthropogenic global warming. I think that would create a kind of fragility in that belief. People might become more skeptical of it, especially if they know that contrary views are being censored. And if that's the case, they might be less willing to take action with respect to it. Again, they start viewing it itself as something that's not completely trustworthy, because if it were true, then why wouldn't we allow people to criticize it, right? So another feature of his argument for free speech, maybe that's related to the truth aspect, is how can we ever be certain that something is right unless we're free to contest it, right? Free to call it into question. So I think Mill would say there are no truths that we should hold sacrosanct and say that can't be criticized, and it has to do with this reason. It will change the way we think about those views if we treat them as things that are fragile, right? Hyper-fragile. This is often the worry about, students in classes. My God, if we say something, will they collapse, right? Same thing is true of truth, I think. So for this reason, I think the global warming example is actually a really nice one, and certainly robust discussion of it has not been leading public opinion towards more enlightenment or more enlightened attitudes towards it. But I think that could be solved in ways short of something like censorship, right?
Thank you.
Sure.
I'll come up here.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today. I have a question. I was lingering and roaming around in the library one day last month, and I picked up a publication regarding colleges and professors, and I was stunned on the article on the front page that had to do with Professor Michael Bonestill from the University of Chicago that ran an art class. He's at the Art Institute there, and it's a comic book class, and it had a lot to do with fringe comics, teaching things about how to do color and design and types of work like that are geared mostly for adult, that talk about things that are not really on the mainstream, but they are very popular as far as graphic arts are concerned. And there was a student in his class who was transgender. Now, I know that that's a popular term right now, that identity politics is really popular, and the teacher was aware of that and tried to use political correctness in his terms, but the student just felt uncomfortable with one of the choices that the instructor used for one of the topics in the class. Mind you that the teacher has been doing the study for over 20 years, and the artist, was a popular, very popular French artist. The student just felt uncomfortable because the subject of transgender came up. And he made a report, and from that, there was a big brouhaha, and the instructor decided to resign over it. So my thing is, within all this free speech that we're offering and all this ideology that we're supposed to be sharing and all of our openness, how does the professor view protecting himself versus giving to us ethically, the student, everything that they can in the in the confines of being a good instructor and giving and sharing all of the information that's available without, even when they feel like they're not focusing on a particular subject. How do they deal with that, and what's their comeback? This particular instructor chose to resign, which is a sad thing, because the development that is promoted from this is that school no longer has that teacher that had year-long waiting lists to get into his class.
Yeah, I think that what this example indicates, without knowing too much about the detail, is the unintended consequences of too much accommodation, right? Of thinking too hard about making sure that you don't offend particular people. This leads to a kind of, rush to the lowest common denominator. But it's not just that. I mean, it seems absurd that one student or a small group of students could actually veto content, or effectively veto content in a classroom. In this case, veto perhaps an instructor. But I think it also encourages a way of confronting disturbing material that's all wrong. And I keep going back to the idea of resilience, but I'm going to go back to the idea of resilience, right? What would happen, really, if you go the extra yard and you desperately try to accommodate students, you try to eliminate everything that might possibly cause offense, I think all it will do is just sort of, raise the bar in some sense. Then students will be offended by, certain looks, or by the way you shuffle your papers, or, it leads to sensitization. The analogy it's coming to mind is allergies, right? We sort of learned that actually the way you deal with children's allergies is to make sure when they're young they get out there and they're playing in the play box with their friends and they're like shoving sand and dirt into their mouths and so forth. You want them to be interacting with their environments, with bacteria and things like that. If you try desperately to protect them from all those things and have them, wash their hands constantly, the result of this is they become hypersensitized to everything like peanut allergies, etc. I think there's a kind of intellectual equivalent of this. Just as there can be a physical resilience in that sense, there's also a kind of intellectual resilience that comes from having to deal day after day with stuff that offends you, and you develop skills in dealing with that. And that would have been a more appropriate response here. That's not to justify, by the way, professors being crude or inconsiderate or what have you. It's not some blanket defense, but I just think in general, when you see a situation like that, it strikes me the problem is not with the instructor, right? The problem, or maybe it's not even with the student, it's with a system that tries desperately to protect students that they take to be hyper-fragile, and perhaps they are, but the systems produce students of that type.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can I just, I'll just add, because anybody who's been around me the last 2 days know that I like to recommend books, but there's one by a guy named Taleb, T-A-L-E-B, called Anti-Fragile, and about this concept of resilience and how we develop it and how you develop that sort of thing. And I highly recommend, his first name is Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and it's called Anti-Fragile. So I should get residual.
Hi. I had a question about Mill on his consequentialism as opposed to the hate speech element that he may support via development. In his political writings, he brings up the concept of, his harm principle, and how if something can be shown to cause harm in the utilitarian aspect of it, where it brings more harm than good, could that element of Mill go actually against his development concept when it comes to hate speech as a political demotivator for marginalized groups?
Yeah, that's an outstanding question. The problem is we're going to have to get pretty deep in the woods to answer it, and so I don't know how. So I'll take a stab at trying to answer. So Mill is ultimately a utilitarian, and not only is he a utilitarian, he's a hedonistic utilitarian in the sense that ultimately he thinks the only thing that's intrinsically good in the world is pleasure, and the only thing that's intrinsically bad is pain. But he's also what's called a qualitative hedonist. That is, he thinks pleasures and pains differ by type, not simply by degree or extent. So he thinks there are certain, for example, certain kinds of higher pleasures. So the pleasures of the intellect, the pleasures of ethical behavior, etc. And then lower pleasures, maybe the pleasures you get from a nice donut or something like this, right? And he could say the same thing about pains, lower pains, and I already made mention of this. Now, how do you distinguish between higher pleasures and lower pleasures? And also, he makes very strong claims. He'll say higher pleasures are not just more important than lower pleasures. They take a kind of lexical priority or absolute priority. You shouldn't give up even the slightest amount of a higher pleasure for lower pleasures, unless I guess those lower pleasures are in some sense preconditions for experiencing the higher pleasures. You gotta eat in order to read and appreciate a poem, for instance. But beyond that, no. Well, how do you make these distinctions? Well, what Mill claims is the competent judge. The competent judge is someone who can correctly distinguish between higher and lower pleasures. What characterizes a competent judge? Who is a competent judge? Is it an ideal type? Does he have actual people in mind? It's not. I don't think it's entirely clear. But the qualities of the competent judge he lays out. He says a competent judge is a person who first has an enormous variety of experience, and particular kinds of experiences of pleasure and pain, such that they are in a position to even be able to rank different kinds of pleasures and different kinds of pains. And moreover, they have certain types of qualities, other qualities. They have qualities of self-reflection, self-criticism, and self-observation. They pay attention to themselves and their experiences. Now, so now go back to your original question, right, about hate speech. So sure, harms can result in the sense that when people say they make hateful arguments, the protocols of the elders of Zion, Jews are injured, I mean, maybe we can say that they actually feel pain as a result of that. And if you care about harm, then why isn't that an argument for regulating hate speech? Here, I think I know how Mill would respond. And the way Mill responds is the way that I mentioned earlier, right? He would say, well, there are higher and lower kinds of pains, and a competent judge can distinguish between those. And the pain of offense is a very low kind of pain. In fact, the best kind of judge can completely dismiss those kinds of pains. A perfect stoic sage, you might say. It just rolls right off them, any claims like this. High pains are the pains of ignorance, right? The pain of not realizing forms of life or forms of arguments that would be available to you if you only knew about them, right? If you only had them presented to you. So the way Mill, I think, would ultimately respond is he'd acknowledge your point about harms. He would just say a competent judge, and this is the relevant judge in this case, a competent judge would judge the pain of offense to be nothing, but the pain of ignorance to be everything, right? And if that's true, that justifies the protection of hate speech. And let me be clear, most people in the world are not competent judges. Most people will feel pain. Most Jews will feel pain upon reading the protocols of the elders of Zion. Mill's recommendation, therefore, is progressive in a certain sense of progress, which is we have obligations to transform ourselves into the kind of people who can render proper judgments about pleasures and pains. And until we do, yes, we'll be deeply offended. It will hurt a lot, but that's a call to self-transformation, right? It's not a call to censorship. And that just brings us right back to resilience again.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. And let's give a round of applause to all of our speakers today. Before we get going, both myself and Professor Schubert have just a quick few remarks we wanted to touch on. One of my favorite parts about these events is that they're a learning experience for me too. Part of my job is going about the country and staffing these events, and I find that I learn something new every single time. And the goal of today was to explore the topic of saying things, something that all of us do every day. And I want to take a quick stab at sort of going through the topics that we touched upon in the past 2 days. I know that not all of you were here for it, but hopefully this can shed some light on it. But we sort of started with the ancient Greeks and the foundational questions in the history of free speech and the ethical arguments for different positions. We also learned about how free speech and open inquiry can sometimes be the last line of defense for marginalized and minorities in society. We also learned about free speech and Title IX culture, and how different policies can lead to the emergence of different cultures, and how these cultures can sometimes end up at odds with each other. We also learned about different policies and different areas that you may not think free speech applies. Sexuality, pornography are two of the areas that were touched upon in discussion. And how academic biases can impact our understanding of the world, and how in-group biases can sometimes prevent truthful ideas from being put out there. And then we also touched on how free speech can be an engine for innovation and economic growth in some cases, and how it can be a positive way to how the exchange of ideas can lead to us all being better off in some ways. And we also learned different arguments for cases when speech should not be heard. We heard a lot of talk about John Stuart Mill and a bunch of different arguments from different perspectives on it. Throughout all of these discussions, I just want to say that we have no agenda for today except for you guys to further explore this question. The conclusions that you take from this are your own, and I hope that all of this sparks some curiosity in all of your minds, and you take it into your classes through the rest of the semester and through the rest of what you choose to do with your lives. Just one last bit about IHS. We're an organization devoted to creating opportunities and supporting students, scholars, and academic communities to explore the great questions that face our society today. And it's a pleasure been supporting CRC and CSUS as they go about this endeavor with giving you all a quality education. Now I'll ask one more time, if you turn to the survey or the schedule in your booklets, I highly encourage you to just leave a note of feedback of what you thought of the day. If you thought this to be valuable at all, it's something that your comments can go a long way for helping donors to continue giving and make events like this possible. In addition, IHS has a couple of resources that you all may be interested in. If you like the format of the day, we also offer a program called our IHS Summer Seminars. And they're basically sort of a format like this, where all you have to do is get to the host university, but we cover room, board, and we have an interdisciplinary discussion with an economist, a historian, a philosopher, a political scientist, and sometimes one other discipline too. But with that being said, I hope if you have any questions about IHS, please come up to me or the lovely IHS staff, Jack and Emmy, who have been manning the registration table. We'd be delighted to share more with you. But with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Schubert with some last remarks.
I'd like to thank Sean Denny, our partners at IHS, our partners at the Sacramento State Center for Practical Professional Ethics, our speakers, you all for coming, and offer special acknowledgement to CRC Media Services, CRC Educational Media Design, our college's radio, television, film production program, who've made the filming of today's portion of the symposium possible, and finally the Sacramento Educational Cable Consortium for agreeing to broadcast this event. So if you weren't able to attend the entire event and you're hoping to catch you wishing you'd caught some of the earlier portions, please look forward to seeing portions of today's program broadcast on Sacramento Educational Cable. Ultimately, the entire program, both yesterday's program and today's, will be available on the Center for Practical and Professional Ethics video archive. Thank you so much for coming, and another round of applause for our speakers, please.